Any building or location has the potential to become abandoned, whether it's an old factory or an old family home. Although you might find a few traces of the past in any abandoned place, most of them aren't all that interesting. They're just empty monuments to what came before them. The places you're about to see in this video are very different. They're strange, unique, abandoned places with fascinating stories behind them. In fact, they're the most unusual real abandoned places in the world. There are a few things that make Igloo City in Cantwell, Alaska a weird location. Firstly, despite being in a cold, snowy location, it isn't a real igloo. It's actually a hotel that was designed to be a tourist attraction. Secondly, even though it's a hotel, it's never welcomed a single paying customer. Whoever started the process of building it during the 1970s was lacking a little bit of knowledge when it came to rules and regulations, and the shell of the hotel was declared to be non-compliant with the building codes of the time. Construction was therefore stopped somewhere around the halfway mark, and it was never resumed. Several owners have come and go since then, each one promising to finish the job, but nobody ever has. Given that it's approaching 50 years since the first stone was laid at the site, it's unlikely anyone will ever finish it now. And so that leaves us with this unwanted 4-story shell. Urban explorers have managed to gain access to the interior in recent years and brought us pictures of the timber framework that's holding the whole thing up. It's hard to call anything in New Delhi, India, abandoned. It's one of the busiest places in the world, especially in the thriving commercial area of Connaught Place. Despite that, if you know which stone wall to look behind, you'll find the stepwell of Agrasen Ki Bauli waiting for you. It's so ornate that it could easily be mistaken for a stone castle, but it served a much more fundamental purpose. It was built 500 years ago as a means of accessing groundwater at all times of the year, and therefore ensuring that the city avoided the risk of drought. Hundreds of stairwells exist in India, but Agrasen Ki Bauli is lucky enough to be conserved and maintained by the government, and so hasn't been worn away like most of the others. It's been abandoned ever since the invention of the water pump, and so these days it has no practical purpose other than being an architectural marvel. The locals find it as creepy as they do charming, though. Every sound made inside the well echoes, and the shadows seem to move as you make your way down the steps. Once upon a time, Okpo Land on Gyeonggi Island in South Korea was said to be the most popular theme park in all of Asia. Today, it's a rusty, eerie wasteland that's been standing empty for 20 years after its sudden abandonment in 1998. The park was famous for its duck-themed roller coaster, but it was its most famous attraction that led to its notoriety, and then its abandonment. The roller coaster would be the site of not just one fatal accident during the 1990s, but two. The first occurred in the middle of the decade, when one of the ducks fell from the rails and crashed to the ground, killing its occupant immediately. A subsequent investigation put the incident down to a freak accident, and the park offered no further explanation or apology. Then, in 1999, the same thing happened again. A duck derailed and the young girl riding inside it fell to her death. This time, the park's owner fled overnight, and the park never opened again. Somewhat gruesomely, the duck cart involved in that accident is still stuck in the exact same position as it was left on that day, dangling precariously from the rails. Back in 1881, the Kerry Furnaces was a major center for American steelwork. The complex covered 400 acres on both sides of the Monongahela River in Pittsburgh, and at their peak, they produced 1,250 tons of steel on a daily basis. That all came to an end in 1978, when it was decided that the furnaces were no longer fit for purpose, and the bulk of what once existed at the site was dismantled and burned to the ground. At the time, the plan was to build a brand new housing development at the location, but those plans never came to fruition, and so the furnaces themselves have been left standing. At 100 feet tall, they make for an imposing sight and have become something of a landmark. Over time, local authorities have come to recognize them as a rare and valuable example of iron-making technology from the pre-war era, and successfully applied to have them designated as a National Historic Landmark in 2006. Since then, work has been ongoing at the site to preserve and maintain the furnaces to ensure that they're still there for future generations to visit. Not so long ago, phone booths provided a valuable public service. If you were away from your phone or your office and needed to contact someone urgently, a phone booth was the only way to get in touch with whoever you needed to speak to. When mobile phones came along and became commonplace, the old phone booths became obsolete almost immediately and started vanishing from the street corners they'd once stood upon. When they disappeared from the street corners of New York, they ended up at this phone booth graveyard in Manhattan. More than 100 of the unneeded booths can be found below the railroad tracks where 12th Avenue meets 135th Street, slowly rusting and falling apart in the darkness. Why they're here is another matter. It can safely be assumed that the material used to make them must have scrap value, so someone must have put them here in an attempt to preserve them. Even though they no longer have a practical use, they found a second lease of life as a backdrop for unconventional photo shoots. Perhaps the most remarkable thing about the so-called Hobbit House in Wiltshire, England, is that it shouldn't exist at all, and was almost built by accident. Everything you can see in these images, from the stained glass windows to the ornate turrets, is the work of one man by the name of Colin Stokes, who spent more than 11 years building the property by hand. By his own admission, the former farmer simply got carried away when he started building it. After buying the land during the 1980s, he'd initially just wanted to build a simple rectangular barn to store his hay, but quickly fell in love with the art of dry stone wall building. The property grew from there, although Collins doesn't like it when people call it a Hobbit House. He still thinks of it as a barn, even though he eventually built a room on the top floor for himself to live in. He might even still be living there now if it weren't for the opening of a quarry nearby in the late 1990s. Colin found that the noise of the quarry disturbed his peace too much, so he sold his land and moved away in the year 2000. The strange barn he built has been standing empty ever since. When communism was the law of the land in Albania, the Pyramid of Tirana was built as a monument to the system of governance. Communism has long since fallen, and the monument isn't far behind it. When you look at it, you can still get a sense of how magnificent it must have looked when it was brand new. But it's crumbling to dust, and the government of the modern era has no interest in repairing it or rescuing it. The pyramid was built in 1988 to mark the passing of former communist leader Enver Hoxha, but by 1991 support for communist ideas was on the decline, and a new purpose was imagined for the structure. That purpose was to be a convention center, but that turned out to be non-viable from a financial point of view. From there, it became a military staging area, and then the headquarters of a television station. None of the new tenants took proper care of the building, and so it eventually became a target for looting and graffiti artists. The government has tried to have it demolished several times, but a small group of locals has, so far at least, successfully campaigned against the demolition every time it's become a realistic prospect. When the Cape May bunker was built in New Jersey in 1942, it was supposed to be a temporary building for use during the Second World War. There was always a plan to take it apart when it was no longer needed, but nobody ever got around to doing so, and it's still standing today. That's a testament to the quality of the thick wooden pilings it sits upon, which should, by rights, have buckled under the weight of the 7-foot-thick concrete walls decades ago. Visitors to the area are always startled to see the sight of the enormous structure, which seems so out of place with everything around it on the beach. But from the point of view of the locals, it's been there for longer than most of them have been alive, and is part of the region's landscape. That may not be the case for much longer, though. Back when it was built, the ocean was 1,000 feet away, even when the tide was in, and it was even possible to walk beneath the bunker. Now, the area below the floor is full of water, and the tide comes right up to the entrance. Eventually, this relic of wartime will be washed out to sea. animal-themed names are common in locations associated with Adolf Hitler. His German mountain retreat was known as the Eagle's Nest, and this hidden Polish forest stronghold was known as the Wolf's Lair. It's also the place where the hated Nazi dictator almost met his end. An assassination attempt involving a bomb inside a suitcase injured him at the bunker in Ketrizin in 1944. The top-secret fortress was built in 1941 to give Nazi leaders a private place to strategize and plot, and became the location where Hitler spent much of his time during the final years of the war. The bomb damaged the bunker and put Hitler off the idea of spending any further time there, and so, with the Russians advancing rapidly, he abandoned it and ordered it to be destroyed with explosives. The explosives weren't totally effective, and much of the Wolf's Lair is still standing, albeit in a state of extreme disrepair. It technically now belongs to the Polish government, after the last tenant of the land it's built on failed to keep up with their rental payments. What appears to be a crashed alien spacecraft in Ransom Canyon, Texas, is actually somebody's former home, although the fact that it looks like a spacecraft isn't an accident. This property once belonged to sculptor Robert Bruno, who built it with his own two hands and worked on it from 1973 until 2008 when he passed away. Standing on four legs, the design is best described as being somewhere between a typical science fiction spacecraft and a grand piano jutting out of the hillside. The exterior of the house is all made of blackened steel, which Bruno welded himself. Internally, the picture is very different. Everything is made of wood, with light coming through stained glass windows. Sadly, the sculptor never finished the property, and so the planned pool and aquarium were never installed, and there are dangerous holes between some of the floors where a staircase should be. In his will, Bruno left the house to his friend and neighbor Charles Hobbs, who has resisted calls to finish the property and sell it or let it out. He insists that Bruno never wanted anyone else to finish his work, and so it should be left to stand as it is. Toward the end of the Second World War, a fleet of 350 ships was amassed at Suisun Bay in California, with orders to be battle-ready at a moment's notice. Even after the war was over, the ships were grouped together as the Suisun Bay Reserve Fleet, with orders that all of them should be kept in a state of readiness. The idea was that if a national emergency arose, the entire fleet could be activated with 20 days' notice. Those orders have never been rescinded, but what's left of this fleet is never going to move anywhere. Only around 10 or so ships of the once mighty fleet are still there, and one by one, they'll soon be broken up and sold for scrap, just like the 340 ships that used to stand alongside them. Years of reluctance to commit funds to the ships, coupled with indecision about the best use for them, ultimately condemned them to rot and rust away until their condition became a pollution hazard to the water they floated in. We may never understand why eccentric French artist Din Edel wanted to build a working cinema in the Sinai Peninsula, but we do know why he failed. Even if you're building in the desert, you still need a permit if you're going to open up a cinema to the general public. Edel didn't have one, and so the local authorities pulled the plug on the very same night that Edel intended to open his so-called Seventh Art Cinema with a showing of the dinosaur movie Jurassic Park in 1993. It would later transpire that he also didn't have the relevant permissions to own and operate the large electricity generator he was using to power the site. Because of those failures, not a single movie was ever shown at the site, and it's gone on to be nicknamed the cinema at the end of the world. It's easy to see why. The rows of sun-bleached chairs sitting in front of an abandoned projector house facing out toward the hills have a definite post-apocalyptic feeling about them. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications, and you will be the first to know when a new video comes out. Thank you for watching, and see you soon.